Imagine being taken from your family as a child, locked inside a golden palace where your future is no longer your own. For hundreds of years, thousands of boys lived this hidden nightmare, forced into silence, stripped of their identity, and treated as shadows in the halls of power. This is the untold story of the Ottoman male concubines, a story so shocking, so heartbreaking, that history tried to bury it forever. Stay with me until the end to uncover the horrific truth. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because the darkest secrets of history are only just beginning to be revealed. In the grand and glittering palaces of the Ottoman Empire, life often appeared to be filled with splendor, beauty, and endless wealth. From the outside, the palaces were marvels of architecture, decorated with gold, marble, and precious stones. The empire itself stretched across vast lands, touching parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the Ottoman sultans were some of the most powerful rulers the world had ever seen. But beneath all of this glory lay a much darker world, hidden away behind walls, where secrets, suffering, and horrors unfolded in silence. This was the world of the male concubines, young boys and men taken into the service of the empire's most private spaces, where their lives were shaped by cruelty, humiliation, and suffering that today would shock anyone who hears it. Yet in their time, these things were considered completely normal. For many of these boys, their stories began far away from the palace itself. Some were born in small villages in the Balkans, others came from distant lands captured during wars, and some were even sold by their desperate families who could no longer feed them. They were young, often no older than 10 or 12 years old, and they were taken from their homes under the system known as devshirme, the collection of boys by Ottoman officials. To their families, it may have seemed like a chance for their sons to live better lives in the service of the Sultan, perhaps to rise to a powerful position in the empire. But the truth was much darker, because for many of these boys, they were destined not for honor or greatness, but to become concubines in the palace, objects of desire and tools of entertainment rather than respected men of the empire. The journey began with separation. Imagine being a boy of 12, ripped from your mother's arms, your cries echoing as soldiers dragged you away. Your father may have tried to resist, but what power could a farmer or shepherd have against the soldiers of the mighty Ottoman Empire? Some boys remembered that last glimpse of their homes for the rest of their lives, the fields, the little houses, the smell of bread from the oven, and the sound of their mothers weeping. They would never return. They were taken hundreds of miles away, sometimes chained together, treated not as children but as possessions to be delivered. Once they arrived at the palace, the boys were stripped of their clothes, washed, and given new garments. Their old names were taken from them, and they were given new names, often Turkish or Arabic, to erase their past identities. This was the beginning of their transformation. They were no longer the sons of their parents. They no longer belonged to their villages or their homelands. From now on, they belonged only to the Sultan. Their entire purpose in life was to serve, and their bodies and souls were considered the property of the empire. Life in the palace for male concubines was filled with constant control and surveillance. They were housed together in quarters that were locked at night, with guards stationed outside. There was no freedom, no chance to run away. If anyone dared to escape, the punishment was brutal, often involving public beatings, whippings, or even execution. The boys quickly learned that obedience was the only way to survive. One of the most horrific practices they endured was the forced castration of some of the boys. Not all male concubines were castrated, but many were, especially those chosen to serve close to the women of the palace, such as the harem. The Ottomans, like many other empires, believed eunuchs could be trusted because they could not form relationships with women, nor could they father children. The castration process itself was barbaric. Often carried out in secret, it involved crude methods with no proper medical tools. And many boys did not survive the operation. Those who did lived the rest of their lives in constant pain and humiliation, their bodies permanently scarred. Yet in the empire, this was seen as normal, a necessary sacrifice for the functioning of palace life. Beyond the physical horrors, there was also psychological torment. The boys were constantly reminded that they were inferior, that they existed only for the pleasure or service of others. They were taught to obey without question, to smile even when they were suffering, and to suppress their true feelings. Many were forced to entertain guests with music, dance, or poetry, paraded like exotic objects for the amusement of the powerful. Some were used as attendants, some as companions, and some as playthings in ways that cannot even be described without unease. What made it worse was that none of this was seen as wrong. To the sultans and the court, it was simply the natural order of things. Despite the cruelty, some concubines managed to find ways to adapt and even rise in the palace hierarchy. A few gained the favor of powerful figures, perhaps by their intelligence, beauty, or loyalty, and they could eventually earn better positions, sometimes even rising to become advisors or holding roles of influence. But this was rare. For the majority, their lives were spent in silence and obedience, never allowed to truly live as free men. Even those who rose in power carried the scars of their early years, never able to forget the humiliation and suffering they had endured. The palace itself, with its towering walls and golden halls, seemed like a paradise to outsiders, but to the concubines, it was a prison. They watched as foreign visitors marveled at the beauty of the harem, the mosaics, the fountains, and the delicate curtains that separated rooms. They listened as guests spoke of the splendor of the Ottoman Sultan, his wealth, and his power. But none of these outsiders saw the boys locked away at night, the tears hidden behind their forced smiles, or the empty stares of those who had lost hope long ago. What made their suffering even more tragic was the way history has often ignored them. While the stories of sultans, viziers, and even the women of the harem have been recorded and retold, the voices of the male concubines were silenced. They left behind almost no writings, no songs, no memoirs. Their pain was swallowed by time, hidden behind the walls of the palace. The few records that exist describe them not as human beings with feelings and dreams, but as property, as servants, as nameless figures who were simply part of the machinery of the empire. Yet, if we look closely, we can still see traces of their lives. In old records, we find mentions of eunuchs who served the harem, who controlled the palace gates, or who were responsible for important tasks within the empire. Some eunuchs gained enough influence to shape politics, whispering in the ears of sultans, manipulating decisions, and controlling access to the royal family. These few men proved that even in the darkest situations, some managed to carve out power. But behind their political influence was always the same story of suffering. A boy taken from his home, stripped of his identity, and transformed into something the empire wanted him to be. For the younger concubines, one of the most horrific realities was the constant fear of being chosen. To be chosen might mean favor, gifts, and survival, but it could also mean exploitation, humiliation, and endless pressure. Boys whispered to each other in the dormitories, fearful of what tomorrow would bring. They never knew if their lives would improve or if they would be dragged into something darker. This uncertainty, this constant fear, ate away at their childhoods and left them broken long before they reached adulthood. The Ottoman Empire presented itself as a beacon of civilization, with its scholars, poets, architects, and warriors. But like many great empires, it also carried within it systems of cruelty that were normalized, hidden behind walls, and forgotten by history. The male concubines were one of those forgotten groups. Their suffering was invisible to the world outside the palace. And even within the palace, it was simply accepted as part of life. That is what makes their story so tragic, not only the pain they endured, but the silence that followed them. The way their lives were erased as though they never mattered. If you imagine the Ottoman palaces today, visited by millions of tourists, you might see the shining domes, the glittering mosaics, the echoes of footsteps in grand halls. But hidden in those walls are the ghosts of boys whose cries were never heard. Their laughter, their tears, their dreams were swallowed by the empire, leaving only faint shadows in history. These were the male concubines, and the horrific things they endured were once considered completely normal. Life for male concubines in the Ottoman court only grew darker as the years went on. Once the initial shock of being torn from their homes had faded, the boys found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of training, obedience, and survival. The palace was not only their prison but also their world, and the longer they remained inside its walls, the more they understood that there was no way back to freedom. The horrors they endured became their reality. And what is most disturbing is that this reality was considered normal by everyone around them. The empire saw nothing unusual in it. To the sultans, the viziers, and even many ordinary citizens, concubines were simply another part of palace life, like soldiers or servants, existing not as human beings but as tools. The daily routine of these concubines was designed to break them down and mold them into silent, obedient servants. Their mornings began early, long before the palace was awake. They were shaken from their thin mattresses by the older eunuchs who oversaw them, commanded to wash quickly and prepare themselves. The concubines' quarters were strict, with no decorations, no reminders of home, and no comfort. Even the windows were small, so they could not look out onto the city beyond the palace. For many boys, years passed without ever seeing the streets of Istanbul again. The empire had stolen not only their freedom, but also their sense of belonging. To the outside world, breakfast was meager bread, olives, sometimes a thin soup, and there was little time to eat. Almost immediately after, training began. They were taught the skills expected of palace attendants: how to walk silently, how to carry trays without spilling, how to bow at the correct angle, and how to respond instantly to commands. Every gesture, every step, every word had to be perfect. A single mistake could mean humiliation, a beating, or worse. Imagine the pressure on a child of 11 or 12, already traumatized by separation, now being forced to act like a flawless servant with the constant threat of violence hanging over them. Alongside this training, there was constant conditioning. The boys were reminded daily that they were inferior, that they were property, not people. Some were told that their families had abandoned them, that they no longer had ties to their old lives. The palace system wanted to erase all traces of their identities, to make them believe that their only purpose was to serve. Those who resisted were broken down through punishment. Beatings were common. Whippings left scars that never faded. Some boys were locked in isolation, forced to spend days or weeks in small, dark rooms with little food or water, until their spirit broke. These punishments were not done in secret. They were carried out in front of the others. As a warning, the message was clear. Obedience meant survival. Resistance meant suffering. But the physical punishments were only part of their torment. The concubines lived under constant surveillance. They were never alone. Every move was watched by guards and older eunuchs, and every whisper was reported. Friendships were dangerous. If two boys grew close, they risked being separated or punished. Trust was nearly impossible because at any moment, someone might betray you to gain favor with a superior. This isolation was one of the most brutal aspects of their lives. Humans crave connection, but these boys were denied it. Their loneliness was crushing, and many grew silent and withdrawn, their eyes empty long before adulthood. One of the most horrific aspects of their lives was the practice of castration. As mentioned earlier, not every boy was subjected to it, but for those who were, it was a fate worse than death. The procedure itself was carried out in unsanitary conditions, often using crude knives or heated instruments. Some boys bled to death. Others died from infections that spread quickly in the days after. Those who survived often lived with constant pain and lifelong health issues. Their voices changed, their bodies developed differently, and they were mocked by some for their appearance. Yet in the palace, they were valued precisely because of this mutilation. Eunuchs were trusted with the most sensitive duties, such as guarding the harem, because they were seen as harmless. But this so-called trust came at the cost of their humanity. The eunuchs formed a strange class within the palace. On the surface, they seemed to hold positions of power. Some rose to oversee entire sections of the harem, controlling hundreds of women and boys, and whispering in the ears of sultans. But even the most powerful eunuch carried with him the memory of how he had been mutilated, how he had been reduced to something less than a man. Power did not erase their suffering. In many cases, it only deepened their bitterness. Some eunuchs became cruel themselves, inflicting the same punishments they had once endured, creating a cycle of abuse that stretched across generations of concubines. Another layer of horror came from the unpredictability of palace life. Concubines never knew what the next day would bring. At any moment, a boy could be summoned to perform before guests, to serve at a banquet, or to entertain the sultan. These moments were filled with fear, because while being chosen could mean a temporary rise in status, it could also mean humiliation or exploitation. Some were forced to dance in elaborate costumes, their movements scrutinized and mocked. Others were made to recite poetry or sing songs, even if their voices cracked with nerves. Failure was not tolerated. A stumble, a wrong note, even a trembling hand while carrying a tray could lead to severe punishment. And then there were the darker summons times when boys were chosen not for service, but for the private desires of those in power. These experiences left scars that could never be healed. For the concubines, there was no choice, no consent. Their bodies belonged to the palace. Many lived in constant dread of being chosen in this way, their childhood stolen in the most horrifying of manners. Yet, again, this was considered normal. The empire did not see these boys as children in need of protection. They were property, and their suffering was simply part of the system. As the boys grew older, their futures remained uncertain. Some who showed intelligence or talent were trained further, perhaps given roles in administration, or as personal attendants to important figures. A rare few might even rise to positions of influence. But for the majority, there was no such opportunity. Once they reached a certain age, they were discarded, replaced by younger boys brought into the system. For those who had been castrated, life outside the palace was bleak. They were often rejected by society, unable to marry or have families, forced to live out their days in isolation. Many died in poverty, their years of service to the empire forgotten as if they had never existed. The psychological damage of this life cannot be overstated. Many concubines developed deep depression, their sense of self completely destroyed. Some turned to prayer, clinging to religion as a source of comfort. Others withdrew completely, moving through life like shadows. A few took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of their suffering. But these deaths were rarely acknowledged. A concubine who died was quickly replaced, his memory erased, his story never told. The Ottoman court was filled with splendor, but it thrived on exploitation. Every glittering banquet, every grand ceremony, every whisper of poetry was built on the backs of those who suffered in silence. The concubines were part of this system, hidden away, yet essential to the functioning of palace life. Their suffering was invisible to outsiders, but it was ever present within the walls of the harem. Even today, when we visit the palaces that remain, we marvel at their beauty. We see the intricate tiles, the fountains, the delicate carvings, but few think of the boys who lived and died there, their voices silenced by history. They were victims of a system that normalized cruelty, that turned suffering into routine. that stripped children of their identities and used them for the pleasure of the powerful. Their stories remind us that behind every great empire, there are hidden truths that are often dark, disturbing, and horrific. And yet, despite the horror, there is also resilience in their story. Some concubines, even after all they endured, managed to adapt and survive. A few used their positions to gain influence, to shape decisions, to carve out small spaces of power for themselves. Their resilience shows the strength of the human spirit, even in the darkest of circumstances. But we must never forget that their survival came at a terrible cost, one that no child should ever have to pay. This was the life of the Ottoman male concubines, a life of suffering, humiliation, and fear, wrapped in the glittering walls of empire. And what is most haunting is that for centuries, all of this was considered completely normal. By the time a concubine had spent several years inside the Ottoman palace, the boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred. For many of them, childhood was something they could barely remember, and freedom was nothing more than a dream. The palace had reshaped them, body and soul, into instruments of service. Yet behind their silence, behind their carefully controlled movements, was an ocean of fear and pain. What makes their story even more tragic is how completely normalized it was. No one questioned the system. No one spoke of its cruelty. For the empire, concubines were as ordinary as soldiers on the battlefield or merchants in the bazaar. But for the boys themselves, every day was a new trial in survival. One of the most overlooked horrors they endured was the way their identities were erased. When a boy entered the palace, his name was often stripped away. He was given a new name, chosen by his superiors, sometimes based on his place of origin, sometimes simply invented on the spot. The name his parents had whispered to him as a child was forbidden. If he slipped and used it, he could be punished. Over time, many forgot their birth names entirely. With their names went their languages as well. Boys who spoke Greek, Albanian, Armenian, or Slavic tongues were forced to learn Ottoman, Turkish, and Arabic. Their old languages were banned. Speaking them was seen as rebellion, a refusal to submit, and was dealt with harshly. The empire understood that language and identity are tied together. By severing one, they severed the other. This cultural erasure was deliberate, a way of ensuring loyalty to the palace above all else. But it created an unbearable loneliness. Imagine a boy of 10 or 11, desperate to remember the lullabies of his mother, but unable to sing them aloud. Imagine him forgetting the exact sound of his father's voice, until even memory felt slippery. This was how the palace broke them, by stripping them not only of freedom but of the very roots of who they were. The education of concubines was another layer of this system. While many assumed they were trained only as servants, the reality was more complex. Some were educated in poetry, music, calligraphy, and even philosophy. Depending on the needs of the court, they were trained to entertain, to appear cultured, to reflect the grandeur of the empire. But this education was not a gift, it was another form of control. Knowledge was carefully filtered, designed to keep them useful but never truly free. They could quote poetry, but they could not question authority. They could write verses, but they could not write their own destinies. For some, this education was a cruel irony. They were taught to appreciate beauty in art, but their own lives were filled with suffering and ugliness. Yet, within this system, hierarchy thrived. Not all concubines were equal. Some boys were considered more beautiful, more talented, or more obedient, and these favorites were treated slightly better. They might receive finer clothes, better food, or lighter duties. But such favoritism came at a price. Being chosen as a favorite meant greater scrutiny, greater risk. These boys were more likely to be summoned to serve at intimate gatherings, where humiliation and exploitation often followed. They lived on a fragile edge, envied by others but burdened with dangers they could not escape. The jealousy this created among concubines often turned them against each other. Rivalries were encouraged by the palace, for a divided group was easier to control. Whispers, betrayals, and false accusations were common. Some boys would deliberately sabotage others to gain favor. Friendships became dangerous luxuries. Trust was a rare and precious thing, and most learned quickly that survival meant silence. Perhaps one of the most shocking aspects of their existence was the casual cruelty of those who controlled them. To the eunuchs and officials of the palace, concubines were not children but commodities. They were inspected regularly, like livestock, for their health and appearance. Their teeth, their skin, their posture, everything was scrutinized. If a boy showed signs of illness, he might be cast aside, deemed unfit. If he grew older and lost his youthful charm, he might be discarded. The palace demanded perfection, and anyone who failed to meet its standards was easily replaced. This constant fear of rejection haunted them. At any moment, their lives could be appended and their value erased. And yet, the empire depended on them. Concubines filled countless roles in palace life. They served food at banquets. They entertained guests with songs and dances. They carried messages between powerful figures. And they even acted as spies, reporting on the conversations they overheard. Some were forced into more intimate roles, attending the harem or the sultan himself. Every task, no matter how degrading, was framed as service to the empire. The boys were told repeatedly that their suffering was an honor, that they were part of something greater. But behind these words was only cruelty. Their labor, their pain, and their silence were the invisible gears that kept the palace running. Another brutal reality was the way concubines were denied any form of family or love. For most, the idea of marrying or raising children was impossible. The system made sure of it. Those who had been castrated were physically incapable, while others were never permitted to leave the palace until they were too old to begin families of their own. Even bonds of brotherhood or affection inside the palace were discouraged. Too long for love was too long for something forbidden. Many concubines died without ever experiencing the warmth of genuine human connection. Their lives were spent serving others, while their own hearts remained starved of compassion. The psychological consequences of this were devastating. Depression, anxiety, and hopelessness were common. Some boys developed nervous habits, trembling hands, stutters, or uncontrollable weeping symptoms of constant fear. Others became hardened, shutting down their emotions entirely in order to survive. This emotional numbness was perhaps the saddest consequence of all. They were still children, yet they were forced to abandon all traces of childhood joy. No games, no laughter, no freedom, only obedience and silence. The punishments they endured also grew more severe as they aged. Beatings were only the beginning. Some were subjected to humiliations designed to crush their dignity. They might be made to kneel for hours in uncomfortable positions, or paraded before others as an example. In extreme cases, boys accused of disobedience or betrayal were executed, their deaths hidden from the outside world. Their bodies were buried without ceremony, their names forgotten. For the palace, one life was nothing compared to the smooth functioning of the system. What is most disturbing is how the outside world often admired the Ottoman court without acknowledging this suffering. Visitors from Europe marveled at the splendor of the palaces, the beauty of the gardens, the elegance of the ceremonies. They wrote admiring accounts of the sultans and their courts. But rarely did they see or choose to see the lives of the concubines hidden in the shadows. The empire's cruelty was invisible, masked by its grandeur. But not all concubines remained silent victims forever. History tells us that some found ways, however small, to resist. A few used their positions as spies to pass messages that could change palace politics. Others found ways to secretly protect younger boys from the worst abuses. There are even stories of concubines who escaped, though these were rare and dangerous attempts. For most, resistance was quiet, hidden in small acts of defiance, holding on to memories, whispering their birth names when alone, or secretly teaching their languages to one another. These small acts, though fragile, were ways of keeping their humanity alive in a place designed to erase it. As the years passed, the horrors of the system never diminished. Generations of boys passed through the palace, each one living the same cycle of abduction, training, obedience, and suffering. The empire thrived on their silence, their invisibility, and perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Their pain was not an accident but an institution. It was carefully built, carefully maintained, and carefully hidden. When we look back on history, it is tempting to focus only on the grandeur of empires, their conquests and monuments. But the story of the Ottoman male concubines forces us to look deeper, to see the human cost that lies beneath the marble and gold. Their suffering was not rare. It was normal. And in that normality lies the true horror. By the time centuries had passed, the system of Ottoman male concubines had become so deeply woven into palace life that no one questioned its existence. It was a silent machine, operating in the background of the empire's grandeur, its cruelty disguised by tradition and routine. For the boys inside, life was a cycle of fear and submission, but history has a way of shifting, and what once seemed permanent slowly began to unravel. The decline of the concubine system did not happen suddenly. It was not the result of a single revolt or rebellion. Instead, it faded like a shadow as the empire itself weakened. But before this decline, countless boys endured horrors that left scars lasting long after the system itself disappeared. Some of these scars were physical broken bodies from beatings, weakened health from malnutrition or disease. Others were invisible minds shattered by trauma, hearts emptied of hope. To understand their story fully, we must imagine what life was like, not just inside the palace at its height, but also during its slow collapse. In the later centuries of the Ottoman Empire, the palace faced increasing pressures from outside powers. European nations grew stronger, and the empire's control began to slip. But inside the palace, the routines of the concubines remained unchanged. Even as war raged beyond the walls, even as politics shifted, the boys still carried trays of food, sang songs to amuse their masters, and endured punishments in silence. Their suffering was so normalized that even the empire's greatest crises could not shake it. What made this even more tragic was the way many of them grew old inside the palace, forgotten and discarded. The system was designed for youth. A boy who had grown into a man lost his purpose. His beauty, once prized, was no longer valuable. His obedience, once demanded, was no longer needed. Many of these men were quietly dismissed, sent away with nothing, no family to return to, no land of their own, no future. They had been taken as children, shaped into tools of service, and then abandoned when they could no longer serve. Some ended up as beggars in the streets of Istanbul, their pasts too shameful to speak of, their identities too fractured to rebuild. Others remained in obscure positions, guarding lesser palaces or performing menial tasks, living in the shadows until death claimed them. There were those who tried to write down their memories, though few of these accounts survive. One can only imagine what such memoirs would have revealed: stories of loneliness, despair, and fear, but also small glimpses of humanity, acts of kindness exchanged in whispers, brief friendships that lit up otherwise dark lives. The loss of these voices is perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of history. We know the system existed, we know its structure, but the inner thoughts of the concubines themselves remain hidden, silenced by time. The outside world, meanwhile, began to take more notice. European visitors to the Ottoman court sometimes hinted at the strange presence of boys in the palace, though they rarely described their suffering. Instead, they often exoticized them, turning their existence into symbols of Eastern mystery and decadence. To the West, they were curiosities, evidence of how different the empire was from Europe. Few ever spoke with sympathy about their pain. This lack of recognition added another layer of cruelty. The world knew of them, yet no one cared to stop their suffering. As the centuries passed, reforms began to creep into the Ottoman state. Western influences pressured the empire to modernize, to abolish practices that seemed outdated or barbaric. Slavery itself was slowly dismantled, though never fully erased until the empire's final years. With these changes, the system of male concubines weakened. The need for them diminished, and the palace gradually abandoned the practice. By the 19th century, the institution was almost entirely gone. But for hundreds of years, it had already claimed the lives and souls of countless boys. The ending of the system did not bring justice to its victims. No monuments were built for them. No apologies were offered. They vanished from history as quietly as they had lived. Their stories were buried beneath the grand narratives of sultans and wars, their voices silenced beneath the weight of empire. The world moved on, but their pain remained in the shadows. And perhaps that is the greatest injustice of all, that the boys who endured so much, who lost their families, their identities, and their futures, were denied even the dignity of being remembered. Yet their legacy lingers in subtle ways. The grandeur of the Ottoman palaces still attracts visitors, who marvel at their beauty without always knowing the suffering that sustained them. The songs and poems of the court, preserved as cultural treasures, were often performed by concubines whose names we no longer know. The empire's image of wealth and power was built in part upon their silence. Their lives, though forgotten, were the hidden foundation of history's stage. To imagine their final days is heartbreaking. Some may have held on to fragile hopes that freedom would come, but they would one day walk out of the palace gates and return to the families they had lost. But for most, that day never came. They died as they had lived, in silence, their names unspoken, their identities erased. They were buried without recognition, their graves unmarked. And yet, in the shadows of history, their presence remains, whispering of the cruelty that once passed as normal. Looking back now, what shocks us is not only the brutality they endured, but the fact that it was accepted by all. It was woven into the empire's very identity. The Ottomans, like many empires, believed greatness required sacrifice. But they never asked whether the sacrifice of innocent boys was too high a price. To them, it was ordinary. To us, it is unthinkable. And that contrast forces us to question what other horrors in history were once considered normal. What cruelties in our own time might one day be judged with the same horror? On the end. The story of the Ottoman male concubines is not just a tale of the past. It is a reminder of how easily human suffering can be hidden behind grandeur, how cruelty can be normalized when no one speaks against it. It is a warning that history must be told, not only through the victories of empires, but also through the silent voices of their victims. The boys who lived and died in the Ottoman palaces may be forgotten by name, but their pain should never be forgotten by history. Their story is a ghostly presence lingering in the halls of Topkapi Palace and other imperial residences. Visitors may hear echoes in the silence, the faint whispers of children who once laughed, cried, and dreamed within those walls. And perhaps, by remembering them now, we restore a small measure of the humanity that was stolen from them. For, though they were denied freedom in life, they deserve recognition in memory. That the empire has fallen, the palaces are now museums, and the system of concubines has long since ended. But the lessons remain. To understand the true history of power, we must look not only at the thrones and crowns but at the suffering hidden behind them. The story of the Ottoman male concubines forces us to confront that truth. Their lives were horrific, their pain was normalized, and their voices were silenced. Yet in telling their story, we give them back what the empire denied them, a place in history, and a reminder that even the smallest voices deserve to be heard.